This is TWiT.
I know you said that security is not your thing, but this is kind of more of a philosophical question. I'll get you to kind of ruminate with me. When I think about security and open source, one of the things that we've seen reasonably recently, and a lot of this actually as a result of the war in Ukraine, is Protestware. And that's the idea of, particularly when it's open source, a developer, gets to feeling passionate about what's going on. And in some cases, it will be as simple as he'll put a log message in every time, his application runs or his library gets called. It'll spit a log message out that, says something about what's going on in some place. One of the notable examples of this was Node IPC. The developer of that included a new library you linked to called Peace Not War, I believe was the name of it. And it did the same thing. It spat out, a message of support for Ukraine and all of that. Except if it detected that you were an IP address coming from Russia, it would attempt to wipe your machine. So that one was not quite as peace, love, and rainbows as it claimed to be. I'm curious though, what the conclusion is that you and or the Linux Foundation have come to about what is acceptable when it comes to Protestware. Like, are we even okay with our machines? When we call a library, it has a off-topic message it wants to tell us. I mean, that's almost like in-app advertising in a way, and it's just a weird place that we've come to. And it seems to me, I wrote about this on Hackaday too. In fact, I'm pretty sure I coined the term Protestware, but that's not the point. But it seems like we almost need to come together and figure out a guideline. Like, what is acceptable here, and what are we going to consider malicious? And some of it's obvious. Wiping a machine is malicious. That's pretty obvious. But at what point is log spam malicious? That eventually becomes a problem too.
Yes. And I want to caveat the early remark. It's not that security isn't my thing. There's just a lot better people than I am at it. I'm a big fan of security here. But there's going to be a lot smarter people that if you really wanted to dig into that, they would be the better people to talk to than me. But I mean, I guess on the topic, it's really interesting in open source communities because sometimes I get a lot of questions when companies are looking to open source something that there's kind of like a fear of loss of control. And I always, and I've learned this from a lot of my colleagues that I've talked to them about. And when you kind of look at open source governance, there's this concept of legislative versus effective governance. And legislative is like the laws you write down, thou shalt, do a release like this. This is how your voting works, yada, yada. But then there's this concept of effective governance. And what we see in open source communities that are successful is that they generally drive by consensus, even if that means it's a lot of work to get to that consensus. And even if sometimes, I can count probably on one hand the number of times that I've been involved in working with an election or a vote with a particular community where there wasn't a consensus vote. And these are ones that have industry competitors all at the table. So it's not like there wasn't tensions that were there, but there was a greater look from those communities of we know in the end of the day, working together is better for all of us. Forking it happens, but it can sometimes cause a lot of fissures and frictions within communities. So I think it's so when we look at sort of the concept of effective governance, when I talk to these companies, I'll be like, yes, you're going to get other people in the project that are maintainers and committers, and they're going to, they might have differences of opinions and things like that. But in the end of the day, they're going to look at you as the people that brought this here and have a high degree of respect and look at you for advice because they knew like you've put the hard work into getting it to this point. And they're going to look to you they're not going to want to kind of turn something that's directly against you. They're going to want to work with you and know that you're a partner at the table. So I know that kind of probably in the surface seems like I'm, entirely dodging the question. I think when we're thinking about, though, this concept here, I feel like there'll be probably a social aspect that comes into play that helps drive a little of this forward. I could imagine, and again, I'm not as directly familiar with the library in there, But I can imagine that even for people that may not have been directly affected by the machine wiping out, they probably weren't all that thrilled about it. And I'm sure, and I don't know where this resolved, but I would assume that maybe that functionality went away or was sidelined. I don't know for sure, but it would stand to reason that that would be the case.
I think the developer got blacklisted from every website that hosts code, and one of his code maintainers took over the project, and everything got cleaned up. If I remember correctly,
well, that solved the problem, so that's good. So I mean, I see that a lot as like communities have this great ability to sort of self-correct because, you know, generally they want to be forces for good, and you could argue that a lot of, you know, what may be some early intents there were intents to be forces for good. Sometimes it runs off the rails, and I see this also a lot in a lot of the work that I see in diversity, and especially, you know, there's been a lot of work in like inclusive naming and things like that. And, you know, if you look back through history, well, you can always find bad actors in anything. I often believe that there's a lot of great intentions where a lot of these things were happened, and maybe these folks just didn't realize the after effects of what all that means. I would call it, if there's a group that really wants to get together and say, hey, we should set some like best practices and guidelines. I'd be up for that being a Linux Foundation project if somebody really be interested in it. I think that would be a really cool idea. I mean, I wouldn't ever position that as like the Linux Foundation says X, because I think that's not where we look to be. But what I would rather think is we have a group of really smart people that care about this quite a bit, that are coming together and collectively saying, hey, this is what we think is right. And if you look at the heart of every project we host here, that's what it's all about. Like, we don't write any of this code, especially me, because you don't see my code. It's awful anymore. The smart people write all the code. And that's what we look to empower and give them the space so that they can focus on that. So, but that probably didn't directly answer the question you're after, but hopefully that gave you at least a way to think about it.
If you are looking for a midweek update on the week's tech news, I got to tell you, you got to check out Tech News Weekly. See, it's all kind of built in there with the title. You get to learn about the news in tech that matters. Every Thursday, Jason Howell and I talk to the people making and breaking the tech news, get their insights and their interesting stories. It's a great show to check out, twit.tv/TNW.